booked and then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. I'm your host, Naomi. Our topic for this episode is the children's book, Little Black Sambo by Helen Bannerman. Our guest is Marv, whom I met through our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Certificate program at Georgetown University. Marv, welcome to the show. Please tell our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Naomi, it's so great to reconnect with you again. Thank you for inviting me to be a guest here today. And I really appreciate the opportunity just to share and be a part of this project that you've created. To all those who are tuning in, hi, I'm Marv Jones. As Naomi mentioned, her and I were cohort mates at Georgetown University in a course on strategic diversity management and inclusion. And it was a great opportunity to connect with a lot of people who are searching for information and trying to better ourselves and get skill sets in that particular field. And it built a lifelong relationship, I would say, with Naomi. Since then, we worked together on some projects that I've had since. And I'm glad she invited me to be a part of this. I come from a military background, spent many years on active duty. If I told you how many, you'd be saying, no, this guy can't be that old. But I will tell you, I spent 41 years on active duty. Again, I'm not talking about reserve time. I'm talking 41 years, day for day on active duty. I had time in the Air Force and the Navy. I retired from the Navy. I was a medical service corps officer, a hospital administrator. And my last job in the Navy, I had a couple of leadership roles where I served as commanding officer. My last job, I was the base commander for Naval Support Activity Bethesda. That's the installation up in Bethesda, Maryland, that houses Walter Reed National Military Medical Center and the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. So that was the pinnacle of my career, and I retired out of that job, and I went to work as a contractor at the Defense Health Agency for a while, and I started also my own consulting company where I do facilitation, training, organizational development and leadership, coaching, and also some DEI training. And so brings me to the point where I am now in my career, still doing a lot of that work.
And you're keeping really busy.
Yes, I am, and enjoying it.
Good. In our first exploration of children's literature on the podcast, we are examining the complicated legacy of Helen Bannerman's Little Black Sambo. First published in 1899, the book tells the story of a young boy in India who uses his wit to outsmart a group of hungry tigers. By convincing the tigers to fight among themselves, he recovers his fine new clothes and returns home safely. Since its debut, this book has existed as a cultural paradox. It is a story of a clever, resourceful child who outwits a group of tigers to save himself. Yet it is also a text inextricably linked to the history of racial caricature and colonialist imagery. While the original narrative depicts a heroic child in British India, subsequent American editions often utilized exaggerated racial caricatures and names that became derogatory and were more frequently applied to Black people rather than Asian Indians. This history has transformed the text from a simple nursery tale into a significant case study on how visual representation and cultural context can alter the reception of a story over time. The history of the removal and censorship of Little Black Sambo is a decades-long reflection of shifting cultural standards regarding racial representation. For several decades after its 1899 release, the book was a staple in primary schools and libraries across the UK and the US. Critics initially praised it for featuring an Asian Indian or Black protagonist who was heroic and clever rather than a secondary character. However, by the 1930s and 1940s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Black educators and activists began to identify the name Sambo and the exaggerated physical features in American editions as harmful racial stereotypes. The push to remove the book from public institutions intensified in the 1950s and 60s. In the 1940s, the NAACP began advocating for its removal from schools, citing the psychological impact of the Sambo caricature on Black children. In 1956, the Toronto Public Library became one of the first major systems to remove the book, sparking a global debate on censorship versus social responsibility. In the 1960s and 70s, school districts in New York, Chicago, and London systematically pulled the book from their curricula and library shelves, categorizing it as contemptuous and demeaning. By the 1980s, the book had largely vanished from mainstream education. This led to two distinct paths for the story: redacted editions and outright banning. Publishers released versions like The Story of Little Babaji in 1996, which kept the plot but changed the names and used culturally accurate illustrations of India to strip away the American minstrel associations. In many jurisdictions, the original text remains restricted or categorized as historical reference rather than children's literature, as the name itself had become a racial slur in the English-speaking world. Today, the book is rarely found in the children's section of modern bookstores. It serves primarily as a case study for historians and educators to discuss how a story about a child's bravery became a vehicle for systematic prejudice through its visual and linguistic evolution. So, Marv, of all the stories from your childhood and beyond, why did you choose Little Black Sambo as the book for us to discuss?
That's a great question, Naomi. And so, as we first communicated about me participating in this project, I reviewed the list of banned books and was scrolling through and saw many of them that appealed to me, many I was familiar with, many of them I wanted to actually review. And this one jumped out at me, and it took me back to a place where I was just learning how to read. I remember the book from my childhood. It was one of the first books that I had read at 4 years old, 5 years old, learn how to read. It took me back to a place of a happy time of me just being able to learn how to read, and a love for books, a love for literature, which has blossomed today. I felt a little embarrassed because it's a children's book, and I have a copy of it there. It's a children's book, and it's a real easy read. And I felt a little embarrassed because it wasn't a novel, but I said, but this resonates with me. This takes me back to a place, again, some of my fondest memories. And so that's why I chose this book, just to revisit that place and that time of me being introduced to literature and books, which have become an important part of my life.
I had no idea that it was one of the books that help you learn to read. That's fantastic. So, the protagonist in the story is notably resourceful and brave. Many modern critics focus on the external imagery and the names. During your upbringing, did you view the character as a caricature, or did you see him as a hero with genuine agency? Do you see the character in the same way now?
So, Naomi, interesting enough, as I mentioned, just being introduced to books and the love for reading, the negative connotations that were displayed in this book flew right past me. Didn't register with me at all. I was more engaged and captivated with the storyline of this young man, and didn't make the connection at all that this had racial overtones. But it was just the story that resonated with me, of him being victorious, him being smart, him outwitting these animals, and having a reward for his family at the very end. So that's what landed on me. As years went on, and some insight from my siblings, who had 8 brothers and sisters, 5 are older than me, and had read the book. And as we learned to read and enjoyed this book, we did actually pick up later on from insight from others who read the book and from our parents that, hey, there's some things you need to know here. But initially, it was like, wow, I'm learning how to read, and this is a great story, and I love it.
So, beyond the plot, how did the tone and atmosphere of the book make you feel as a child? And I think you've already touched on this, but I want you to go deeper. Did those feelings change as you became aware of the book's controversial status?
Absolutely, it did, Naomi. And as I mentioned, started out as a young man, young child, learning how to read, was very naive at first glance. The first book that I had read that had any visual depiction of anyone who resembled me in any fashion. And so although I identified with the character via his age and via his skin pigmentation, I did not connect the caricature to my life at all. As I became older, as we started to have conversations in our community and in communication with our parents, I started to realize that, wait a minute, this is really interesting. And some things came out and stood out to me that, of course, over the years made me really question what was going on. Particularly some of the storyline is fantastic, but just some of the illustration itself. And it was illustrated by Florence White Williams. And some of the depictions were pictures like this. Now, what takes me back today is Helen Bannerman. The story of her when she developed this book. She was riding on the trains in India. Her husband was a medical officer over in there in the colonial times. And she was writing these little stories like Little Black Sambo for her children to help, communicate with her children. And she uses color throughout the book. She talks about blue pants and red jacket and a green umbrella. She uses color. But it was interesting to me that she used color to depict the people as well. And so if the story was to help you communicate with your kids and tell them stories, I was wondering, why did she go so far into coloring the people as well? Little Black Sambo. The mother name was Black Mumbo. The father name was Black Jumbo. It's like, what is this about? Why? What is she trying to say here? And so that stood out to me. And that's why I started to peel back the onion a little bit. And again, over the years, this book got lost and out of my mind. And when I saw it again, though, it just brought back some of those questions I had. Well, what was Helen Bannerman really trying to say? What was her message? If she was trying to teach her kids something, why little white Sambo? Why not just Sambo? Why did it have to be little? And the interesting thing, too, again, the depiction of the kids, those look very African to me, with the nappy hair, with the bulging eyeballs, with the oversized lips, the real dark skin pigmentation. And I haven't met any Indian people in my lifetime that resemble this. So if your story is based in India, why this? And it was sad too that the illustration was adopted from some sketches she had made while she was writing the story. And so that was taken, of course, through the years. Many versions of it have been displayed, but it just made me think, what was the real message here? What were you trying to say, Helen Bannerman? And where you were trying to go with this? If she was here today, I would ask that question. Tell me about your ideation of what message you were trying to get across here.
Yeah, and we can never know what an author really intended. And so I don't want to speculate on that. But when I see those pictures now, I definitely associate them with minstrelsy. Black Mumbo looks like a mammy figure to me. And like you said, the large lips and like the white around the mouth, but then the very dark. Yeah, exactly. And the headscarf, all of it is very much like minstrelsy or from the vaudeville shows, which of course has a very negative connotation today. I don't even want to go into, like, sometimes the minstrels were white performing in blackface, which is really weird. And there's all kinds of things down that direction.
Right.
So I don't know that I read this story as a child. I think I knew about it. And the reason I knew was I grew up in northern Nevada, a very rural area, and sometimes we would go into Reno. And there was a restaurant chain, and I think it was primarily on the West Coast. It was called Sambo's.
Sambo's, yes.
Yeah, and it was like a Denny's, right? And that's where sometimes we would go. And eventually they all closed down. But I do remember my mother telling me that the name of the restaurant was based on a children's story, but I don't think I ever saw or read the story. I don't think it was available to me when I was growing up, which may or may not have been a good thing. I think it probably was a good thing it was not available, because I don't think I would have had the cultural context to actually understand what was going on in the story.
You make a good point. If I could tag on to what you just said, Naomi. First of all, Sambo's restaurant started in the early 70s. The food was incredible. Great place to eat. And it was based on this character, Little Black Sambo. Although the restaurant was just what's named Sambo, they didn't call it Little Black Sambo, it was just Sambo's. But initially, in its very first opening, they had the depiction, the caricature of the real black child. After a lot of complaints, that was during the height of the civil rights era as well, a lot of complaints, they changed it and it became a character that didn't have blackface. It was just a young boy. but still the name, because that name was associated with pickaninny and negative connotation. And so there was a lot of protest over the years, even though we patronized the restaurant. You always went in there with that in the back of your mind, like, Sambo, wow, I've heard that. I've been called Sambo before. And so that kind of stuck with many people over the years. And as their business model kind of fell apart, they did sell off to Denny's, and I think it's Friendly's took over a part of. But really interesting. I think about 2023, 2024, the very last Sambos was still in operation in Santa Barbara, California. The owner, he called it Sambo's because his father's name was Samir or something like that. And so he said, hey, I inherited this restaurant. It come from my grandfather and his father. The name was Sam. And so I kept that name. What the patrons were trying to tell him, those who had concerns, but there's a stigma with that. And here's what it means, and here's how it affects us. And so he was under pressure to change the name. He relented for a long time. There was a element in the city, in the town as well. To me, yeah, stick to your guns. Don't give in, you Sambo. But he eventually relented and he changed the name. But it took all the way into 2024. That name, the restaurant, was still, it was the very last one. It was still in existence. But he changed the name to, I forget what he changed it to, but it was something, of course, not without the same connotation. So interesting point that you brought up.
Well, and it also just the fact that he held on to the name for such a long time, it puts me in mind of the Washington team now called the Commanders, because there was that same kind of entrenchment and unwillingness to relent and change the name when the owner, whoever, had been told over and over, this isn't okay. This is a slur. This is how this is perceived now. We need to change it. And that took some doing too. So how did you process the character as a Black child in a setting that was geographically ambiguous or foreign to your own environment? I'm also curious as to how your parents treated this book. Was it presented to you as a heroic tale, even though I know you read it that way, or did they present it to you at some point as an example of racism?
Yeah. So, Naomi, how I mentioned initially processed, this kid is a hero. I love him. He's great. And didn't make the connection of race or any of those things. And as time grew, as of course, as issues in our community became more prevalent, showing the separation of races and how these things affected us as a culture. Yeah, I did become aware. And these things, it stuck with me. And I started to look at it through a different lens. I started to feel like, wow, this book really sends the wrong message. I'm a Black person, but I don't look like that. And again, if this is a book and it's supposed to be based in India, why are they looking like this? So you got African looking people here, but there's no tigers in Africa. So where are we going? Tigers don't exist in Africa. The ecosystem between Asia and Africa won't allow, is too different. So it just kind of puzzled me. And then after years, this kind of went out of my mind altogether. But I do remember, the connection. And when I saw this book on the list of banned books, I said, you know what? What did my parents tell us about that? I had to think back. My mom just passed away 6 months ago. She's 98 years old, and she had a great life. And I wish I had a chance to ask her, Mom, remember that book? And I asked my siblings. I said, do y'all remember the book? Yeah, we remember that book. That was one of our favorite books. I said, what did Mom and Dad share with us about that? And one of my older sisters said, Mom and Dad told us that is not us. That it's a good book, but this is how some people will view you. But don't you let them put you in that box and say, this is you. Because you don't look like this. You have similar characters in color, but your skin is not that Black. Your skin is brown. You're a Black person, but your color skin is not Black. And so they gave me some insight and talked about how the book made them feel too. I had a little Zoom call with my brothers and sisters, and it affected them. They said it really messed with her self-esteem, that this is how people saw them. And yet she said that my parents taught us that don't let anybody define you by their view of you. You know who you are. And these are the values that your parents are teaching you, and you carry those values with you through life. And don't let anybody put you down to tell you you're pickaninny, you're less than, because of their view of what a Black person should be. You know who you are, and own that. And so that made me feel good that they shared that with me. My siblings shared their perspective and my parents' view of what they were told. I didn't particularly recall my parents having a conversation with us. They said, yeah, Mom and Dad set us all down. I mean, I was probably the youngest one of their group. They sit us all down. Here's a book, and we want you to learn how to read and enjoy reading, but you don't have to believe everything you read, particularly when someone is trying to say this is you. And so that resonated with them, and I was glad they were able to remember that and share that with me today.
I think that's a great message from your parents. And may your mother's memory be a blessing. 8 years is a pretty good run.
Yep,
You
she
know,
did.
that's
She did pretty
impressive.
good. Yep,
But I'm sure you still miss her and your siblings miss her. So, I know that her memory is a blessing for you.
it truly is.
So, this book has been removed from many libraries and schools due to its historical associations. Some would argue that removing the book protects children, but perhaps it simply erases a piece of complex history. What is your perspective on the tension between the book's controversial legacy and the impact it had on your own development? How do you navigate the difference between the original story set in India and the later versions that adopted American racial stereotypes?
So, guess a good point that you make there, Naomi. Good question, because I did happen to pick up some of the modified versions. This one right here came out later, and different illustration. You see the child on there doesn't resemble in detail the one in the book illustrated by Florence White Williams. Looks more like an Indian child, and throughout here you see just a total visual depiction that more resembles a Indian person in Asia. This was illustrated by Christopher Bing. I think this came out in the early 2000. It talks about a story where he had a conversation with Louis Gates, right? Told him, hey, here's what I want to do. I want to kind of re-illustrate this book. It's a story that's been out there for 127 years, and changed the title. It's called The Story of Little Black Sambo versus the original was Little Black Sambo. And so I appreciate the efforts that people are trying to make to repackage this great story of triumph, a story of resilience, a story of fighting through. And it's a story that's worthy to be told without the stereotypical caricature of somebody who really doesn't fit the storyline. And so, to answer your question, I appreciate those efforts, and I hope we see more of that. Some people, oh, you're changing the world. When it needs to be changed. If we're to help children grow up and feel great about themselves, we need to give them the tool and give them the encouragement and give them the motivation to do so without making them feel bad about themselves. Because again, like I said, when I first started reading, there were very few books that had anyone that resembled me. And so my first introduction to the book, and I see someone that would look like a pickaninny, I said, wow, that didn't make me feel good. And there's been other stories too. It's been modified. The Sam and the Tigers is another version of it. And you see again, another visual depiction that more resembles something that's more in line with how people would probably want to be represented in the book today. This is illustrated by Jerry Pickney. Again, another good example of, hey, if we're going to do this, let's do it where we can make people really see themselves, not through your lens, but give them something positive. They can see themselves through a lens that really makes them feel dignified and good about themselves.
I
I'm not
think
sure if I
that
answered your question, but
No, you did. And I think that's so important. And, just to kind of jump on that a little bit, we change other things. So when my mom read the Nancy Drew mysteries when she was younger, Nancy Drew had a little blue roadster, or, there were certain things that were different than the version I read. So I was reading them probably in the late 70s, early 80s, reading versions from 1950s. So by then, Nancy Drew had a convertible. There'd been some updates, like the way her clothing was described or whatever. But in those 1950s versions, there was one mystery where they were in the South on what used to be a plantation, and they used the word pickaninny to describe Black children. And most of the villains in these Nancy Drew mysteries, they were described as swarthy. They had swarthy skin. It's like, I don't even know what that is, but it was just very strange. And so they've since revised those Nancy Drew mysteries. I don't know when it was done. I'd have to look up the publication dates, but they have since revised them again. And I'm hoping that this time they took out some of those references that in modern times are not as appropriate, right? So I think it's important that we're open to change so that we can take the good things like a great story and still have the great story and have a hero but also have better representation, of how people actually are.
And Naomi, I do find value too. I was glad that I was able to find an original copy of the books because what this is able to show is progress. I can sit down with my grandchildren today and say, this is how this book was presented to me. And this is one of my first reads. And this is what I said. You see anybody in it that looks like you? Not really. They call me G-pop. Not really G-pop, but it's good to be able to show we've made progress. Back, and this was acceptable back in the day. 127 years ago, this was acceptable. This was okay. But is not as palatable as it is today. And hopefully we don't get to a point where this becomes acceptable again. That we do what we can to make sure that people feel represented, they feel heard, they feel they have a voice, they feel that they're seen, but they're seen not in a negative fashion. They're seen in something that they can find value in.
So, given the complexity of the book's history, what is the final thought or lesson you want to leave with our listeners today?
I guess the final thought would be is I'm glad that we live in a society where we can be open, we can share our thoughts, we can share our opinions, we can share literature, we could talk about some of the things that make us uncomfortable. We can have dialogues or discourse, and we can even disagree about it. But we could have a platform where we come and talk about it and express. I would be open to feedback on some of the things that I shared here if someone feels different about it. And that's how we learn. That's how we able to build that bridge and be able to meet each other where each other are. You may not agree with Marvin Jones. That's okay. Hope you value my opinion. I'll value yours. And we can respect each other in that way. But I think that the message is be open-minded. Books are banned. Why? Because they affected certain people certain ways. And yet you can still find them. And we can have dialogue about it or learn why does this offend you so, Marvin? What about this book affected you? And I can hear from your story. Hey, why did it not affect you? And what did you come up or what make you felt that this would be acceptable in your community or where you grew up? And so I think again the final message for me, Naomi, is keep reading, keep the conversation going, keep being open, and seeing each other through a lens where we value each other as individual human beings, not as you're part of this group, and so you feel that way. Get to know Marvin Jones as an individual human being, and I get to know you, and that way we can go and have a great relationship.
Well, and I think you and I do have a great relationship, and we're going to keep talking about stuff like this, which
I look
is,
forward to it.
why I love it. Thank you so much for all of your insights today, Marv. This has really been so much fun. Our next episode will be a discussion of A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. Thank you, listeners, for joining us. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here. Booked and banned, we take a stand, turning words into common ground. Booked and banned, come take my hand, we're rebels with a paperback